Well, welcome to our third community call, everybody. It's good to see everyone again. And we're doing this one live again, just like we did last month. Hopefully we worked out most of the kinks there. We'll try to wrap this one up this month a little bit more quickly, just to leave some time for discussions beyond the formal agenda and questions and anything anybody wants to chat about. So this month, we're going to have fewer demos and more of a discussion of kind of interesting work happening in the broader ecosystem around the Moddable SDK. So I'll just very quickly, when we get going here, run through the highlights of the March release. That's the 3.7.6 release of the Moddable SDK. And then I'll be inviting in two additional speakers. Peter Hottie is going to give us a quick update on ECMA-419 Second Edition. And Nick Hehr is going to be joining us to discuss XSDev, a Node.js CLI project that he started to simplify setting up and working with the Moddable SDK. So I'm very excited to kind of get those additional voices on here and hear about everything going on around the Moddable SDK, not just kind of tightly in the Moddable SDK. And then, as usual, at the end of the call, we'll have some time for Q&A with the team. So let me get my screen share going here, and I will pull up the March 2023 release notes. Screen share, that one. There you go. Okay, and so what you're looking at now is the Moddable SDK 3.7.6 release. And this month's release notes are, as we note in the notes, a little more modest than last month. The Moddable team has been focused on projects that use the Moddable SDK and on some kind of forward-looking experiments, things that are going to be coming down the road over the next few months. So there were fewer internal additions to this release than normal, but there were still several community contributions and some smaller internal additions that I think are worth celebrating. So I want to kind of run through these real quick and note those. The most kind of visible additions this month were new contributions and fixes around device support. So thanks to @Kitazaki, we now have support for the M5 Atom S3 Lite, a newer device in the M5 line. And thanks to contributions from @NextWorldLab, we have improved support for pulse width IO on the M5 series of devices, as well as more stable flash defaults on the M5 Atom S3. Our smallest port, the ESP8266 port, has seen some refinements this month due to fixes for message queues, for the ECMA-419 TCP socket module, and for the URL module. And then there's one small bullet point here that I know represents a lot of work that was done by Peter Hottie that hopefully we'll hear more about in a future month. But we now have support for 8-bit SPI in our ILI 9341 driver running on the ESP32 S3, the S2, and the C3. The possibilities there for kind of pushing out higher frame rates on those devices to both large and small connected screens is really intriguing. So I suspect that everybody will see some work coming down the road on that. Other additions that I really want to call out in particular include updates and fixes to documentation from @NickThrough and @TVE. And then @TVE also contributed several fixes to the ECMA-419 MQTT client and pointed out an important conformance issue we were having on ESP32 and ESP8266 around SPI that we were able to get a fix in for this month. So glad to have that. Thanks to our friend @NickThrough, we were able to fix a bug that I wrote in the Wi-Fi module. So thanks for that. My bad. And we have new typings that were contributed by @CHIGIX for the console module and the secure socket module. So super happy to have additional typings coming in, helping kind of bridge the gap between the Moddable SDK world and the TypeScript world. And if you're into TypeScript and you want to kind of take part in the conversation going on around how should the Moddable SDK support TypeScript and what should that look like, there's actually an interesting conversation going on, I believe, in our GitHub discussions. I don't think it's on an issue. I think it's in GitHub discussions right now. So if you're a TypeScript nerd and you want to get in on how we implement that type of support, please jump on to our GitHub discussions and let us know what you think. So if I switch my screen share, which I surely know how to do by this point, here we go. I'm going to pull up the full list of March contributors there. And the only people I think I didn't call out on that walkthrough there is Agoric. Thank you to Agoric, as always, for support for fuzzing and for test development. But this is our kind of crew of people that were able to file issue reports that we got to this month and that put in contributions that make the Moddable SDK stronger. So thank you for doing that. And with that, I'm going to start handing off here to our updates on Moddable SDK ecosystem projects. So next up, we have Moddable CEO Peter Hottie, who's going to give us an update on the ECMA-419 standard and the TC53 working committee's march towards a second edition of the spec text. So Peter, take it away.
Boom, there you go. Can you, I just threw the spec, the first edition spec up on the screen. Can you see that?
You're perfect.
Cool. So this is just a quick update. For those of you who aren't familiar, ECMA-419 is a standard that we've been working, Moddable's been contributing to for the last few years. The first edition was published 2 years ago. And covered all kinds of nifty I/O things primarily, but also sensors. And a lot of this work has made it into the Moddable SDK and has been adopted by projects like the Node-RED MCU work. A couple years later, we're working on finishing up the second edition. We've got a GitHub site, ECMA TC53, and you can find the working draft for second edition there. I want to encourage folks to take a look. We're aiming to have this thing locked down and official by June of this year. So this is a great time to review, to learn about what's in there, but also, you know, you'll probably spot something that we missed. This spec is really significant. There's a lot of new text defining different data types, defining asynchronous support with callbacks, which is new in this release, including for I2C and SM bus. This release also has a whole bunch of new sensor classes, including a lot of gas sensors. We added real-time clock component support. There's also a huge number of network protocols, HTTP, NTTP, WebSockets, MQTT, and all of this stuff is going to get standardized, at which point it gets a lot harder to change. And as it gets standardized, our intention is to adopt these APIs in the Moddable SDK. A lot of them are already still there in early form, and to then sunset the current classes that support these functionalities. So this stuff is a big deal in terms of where the Moddable SDK is going. And so this is an opportunity, if you can find a few minutes to review a little bit of it, for you to learn about those new technologies and to contribute to making them as solid and complete as possible. So thank you. Back to you, Andy.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. Excited to see that starting to really solidify, and it'll be great to get that published. A tremendous amount of work that many members of our community have done has gone into that second edition draft. So very exciting. Next, I want to give the floor over to Nick Hehr. Among many other things, Nick is a friend of the team, a major contributor to the ECMA-419 spec that we were just talking about, and the creator of XSDev. XSDev is a tool we introduced here last month that automates common Moddable SDK tasks like getting set up, updating, running examples, and creating new projects. Super excited to have Nick here to talk about it, so I'll just hand off to you. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Andy, and Peter and everyone. So yeah, my name is Nick. I am a front-end developer at a company called Betterment, but in my free time, I like to work with embedded JS and embedded devices. Actually came to know Peter and Andy and the Moddable team through a different community from the Tessel and Johnny 5 ecosystem, where I was a maintainer of both projects for a little while. Tessel, unfortunately, is no longer maintained or updated, but it was how I got my hands kind of dirty into the embedded JavaScript world, especially on the networking side, which is where I think I've provided the most feedback on the ECMA-419, which is why the next draft is so exciting to me. So I came from those communities of, bringing JavaScript developers to embedded devices, and have been really enjoying what Moddable brings in terms of its efficiency and what you can target for those devices. And so I wanted to bring the same sort of ergonomics that I saw from Johnny 5 and Tessel to, the Moddable and XS ecosystem and ECMA-419. So I'm just going to share the doc site here. So XS Dev was started basically as a way to codify what was already documented by the Moddable team on how to set up, the SDK itself, any of the other tooling for ESP8266, ESP32, basically the popular devices, especially the Pico as well. And originally, this was just a Node.js script that went through and pulled down the SDK, did the make commands, and then did a bunch of other stuff to basically get everything set up. And then you could still go and use nc-config and all the other regular things as expected. As that started to take shape and become, easier and easier to use, I started to add a bit more opinions on how, I liked to use, the build system and set up projects and everything, and created more features and efficiencies around that. So now it's a full CLI rather than just a Node.js script that has, a bit more scalable support for not just, Mac, but also Windows and Linux. And thank you, Andy, for all his support on getting the Windows support in there. And, we're trying to make sure that's stable as we go forward too. So from the documentation here, you can see kind of the features that we have overall of like, okay, you're going to be expected to install this from using like the NPM or the Node ecosystem. So you can use whatever package manager you want to install it. You can also update, the XS Dev CLI from there. And it has the various features as Andy described. So we have, various setups. You can even target certain branches right now. Thankfully, it's becoming even easier and quicker because of these pre-built releases that the Moddable team has put out. So it'll just pull that down and make sure it's ready where expected inside of your computer and your development environments, and do various checks to make sure it's ready to go. But you can also, if you're, a person working on Moddable directly, you'll pull down the public branch or another branch to say like, okay, I'm working on this, part of the Git repo, and it'll just go and build that by default. And then you can select other devices, and we can give you a list of devices that you want to set up as well to pull in the various ecosystem tooling that you need for that in terms of, the Espressif SDK or Pico tool and all the various things that goes with that. And then we started adding additional tooling, including like FontBM when that was introduced, to make that easy to set up and get running. So, and say, as Andy described, you can also update very quickly. You can just do, I should probably say update. So we're finding bugs in real time. And then you can just, as soon as a new release comes out, you can say XS Dev update and then get the latest release pulled down and working right away. We also make it quick and easy to remove this stuff. If like I do this all the time because I'm working with new releases and testing new features. So I just tear down the whole environment and reset up again. And it takes me, less than 5 minutes to uninstall and reinstall all the Moddable tooling and stuff that I need, which I think is super helpful. And the opinions we started adding on top of this that isn't necessarily provided by Moddable right away is like the ability to scan for new devices. This is something that I really enjoyed from my work with Tessel, is like we could just scan not only wired devices, but also wireless devices through some tooling magic to look for devices that you could then send code to. And so this is kind of basics to look for available like Espressif or Pico devices, connect to your computer in case you need to look up a port or look for various features. Andy described, we have project creation. You can scaffold new projects based on, maybe if you're using TypeScript, if you're using ECMA-419, also but using an example project as your base as well. So you could say like, I want to grab, MQTT as my base, and I'm going to be using that. So that'll scaffold my project with all the different modules and pointing to there. And also adding on, you could just still use MC config and MC run and all those sort of CLIs yourself, or just instead of having to pass all those flags, I found it easier for me to just call xsdev run or xsdev build in order to just quickly build my project, or even select an example, as Andy described as well, and select a target device, give some more interactive feedback as part of that. And then we just recently added the new log flag that was added in the last release, not the most recent one, but the one before, to allow you to just see that in your terminal rather than through the XSBug if you don't need the GUI open, or if you're working a headless environment. And then recently also, Andy and Peter added in the config flag to allow you to pass in, SSID and other sort of configurations that you want through MC config. So yeah, we're slowly building it up, and right now it's still considered pre 1.0, mostly because we want to get that Windows support stable before we can say like, okay, this is a good baseline for covering all the features, and that people working with XS tools can depend on this to be stable before we start maybe exploring what the future looks like for XS dev and moddable development. And parts of that for me is trying to expand the scope and capabilities potentially of what XSDev provides to other projects in the ECMA-419 ecosystem. It's called XSDev, but we could also support things like Esprino or Kalima and some of those projects that we could build ECMA-419 APIs for. And there's also work to get ECMA-419 APIs in Node.js and those types of, and to target things like Raspberry Pi, like the full board computers. And then looking into how we can bring in third-party module support, so you can, npm install something or use a Git submodule or however you want to do it in order to, we're still deciding on how well to integrate that. And there's a whole discussion here if you want to go check that out and provide your input on how you expect to use third-party, modules with XSDev projects. And so I've been working and talking a lot with the Moddable team about like what's the best way that they can support it on their side, potentially pull out a bunch of the like vendored examples and modules that they have to make that a bit more available to the community. And then looking at potentially replacing all the non-JS tooling with ones that are native to JavaScript. So I've been exploring how we could potentially replace like the ESP tool, Python dependencies and everything with something that could just be run through Node.js. This would make setup incredibly much easier and easier to maintain, because I have trouble maintaining Python stuff because I'm not familiar with it. And not to say that Python is bad, it's just not familiar to what I'm used to using. So it'd be great if I could have something native to, the languages I'm using that I can debug and figure out how to manage those, language dependencies and tooling dependencies and everything. And then eventually, potentially XSDev becomes more than a CLI. It could become, a core that powers a CLI, but also powers like a VS Code extension to make it easier to work within your editor and just run a project at a selectable device. And then overall, I really want to be able to support more education and tutorials for folks who want to get into embedded development. So I've started working on a guide here and starting to expand that out to make it like a full, like, how do you get from installing to shipping something in the emulator that looks really fun, and then shipping something onto the device, and how do you keep expanding and learning from there? Potentially partnering with other projects like Adafruit or SparkFun, like I have in the past, to say like, how do we get more resources about using, ECMA-419 and embedded JS to the wider ecosystem. So I'm really excited about what we can do there, and what we can do with, starting to abstract a little bit on the great work that Moddable has provided already. So it's not all in their hands, but that the community can also support through, just adding a little layer on top of it, and seeing how we can figure out like the best ergonomics for whoever's working with it. Like my view is bringing, embedded or JS developers to embedded, but other folks might want to have a better way of bringing embedded developers to JS, which is one of the greatest chapters in the Moddable book about like what is, C for JavaScript developers, but also JavaScript developers for C developers. And I think it's really great how we can provide tooling on top of that.
Yeah, I really think it's exciting to see these types of projects coming together where Moddable, which is the Moddable SDK is a niche thing that a lot of people in both the JavaScript world and the embedded world haven't heard of, but that I think is a really great fit for a lot of problems that people have. Seeing the Moddable SDK get tied into these broader ecosystems and seeing other projects that support ECMA-419 coming online and seeing support for those woven into the Moddable SDK and into the same tools, I think is very exciting. So I'm looking forward to seeing where all of this is going. That's very cool. And as Nick said there, the Windows port of XSDev needs some more eyes on it. I am a Windows developer, but if I've learned anything over the past few years, it's that everybody's Windows machines are quirky. So we're going to try our best to get more people out there working with that. Peter, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm using this spiffy feature of Zoom.
So
Nick, first, of course, thank you for all your work on XSDev. It is, it's amazing. It's a really great effort to make the work that we're doing more easily in reach of a lot more people. And it's motivated some really good changes to the core Moddable SDK along the way, and uncovered more than a few problems. So that's all great and much appreciated. I think one of the things that you touched on briefly that I find kind of honestly would be like the most fun about XSDev that I just wanted to highlight is kind of like that sense of discovery. There's a lot of features in there that are interactive. You talked specifically about scanning for devices, and XSDev is doing something in conjunction with the Moddable SDK that's very unusual, which is it's scanning for devices across vendors and across silicon families. And so you're not just like looking for ESP32s, but you'll find everything out there that's supported. And that's really cool, but and interactive. But there's also things like looking for examples. You just kind of start typing, "Oh, I'm looking for HTTP," and it'll like find all the HTTP examples for you. Or I'm looking for digital, it'll find all of those for you, and you don't have to go navigating around. It just kind of magically happens. And the same for modules. And I mean, I've used that myself to just kind of explore our repository, which I should know better than I do. And so I think that kind of thing sort of takes tasks which could seem like a chore and makes them kind of fun and discoverable and learnable moments. And so I think that's a really nice characteristic of XSDev that I kind of hope will continue to be a feature and a characteristic of new things that go in. On the road to new things, I think one of the topics that is I wanted to ask you to talk maybe just a little bit more about your thoughts on. There's plenty of interesting modules and code out there that work with the Moddable SDK, and people really can't discover those and can't easily discover those and can't easily incorporate them into their projects. So you've kind of taken care of that for stuff that's local to the SDK, but there's sort of a more global problem. I'm thinking about even just things like J5E from Donovan. Adding that to a project is a little bit of a chore. And so, of course, makes it less likely that I'm going to do that. And so I know you've at least explored and thought about this a bit in XSDev. Do you want to just maybe share some of your thoughts on that? Because I think that's a really important future like potential feature.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to tackle, because we could say, like, just use npm as the registry and the way of shipping around packages. But that comes with certain complexity involved, because you have to make sure that, npm, like the thing being shipped, is going to be easily pulled in. And so much of what is on the registry tends to be something that's already pre-bundled or pre-built, and has certain expectations that is not, matched by what Moddable and the manifest has today. And we can also just use Git, which is a way to pull stuff in, because you can get submodule or even vendor stuff down. But it also has its own sort of complexities with staying up to date and having versioned things. You can always have tags. So there's ways to do that. So it's, I think J5E is the example you brought up. So Donovan has shown that you can npm install it and then update your manifest.json to point at that, just in the same way you can point to the Moddable SDK just through like an environment variable, to say, okay, here's where the manifest lives within node modules. And so we could automate that sort of workflow fairly easily. And we could improve discovery by saying, okay, XSDev will automatically look for, modules with this sort of prefix or tag associated with it, to say this is a, officially supported community module, because we followed this guidelines. Projects like ESLint do this for certain conventions. There's like the stuff built into npm and Yarn and some of the other package managers where you can say like npm create blah, because the package has a certain prefix of like create, React app as the example, is that kind of inspired that. So we could set up conventions that the community could follow, and to make it more easy to both discover, as you said, and also pull in and, clarify that this is a working module because it follows these conventions. It has a manifest.json that we can point to within the package JSON. And but also making sure that we're maybe careful around how deep do those go, because as npm and JavaScript developers and many other developers, you start to build these layers of like, this thing depends on, J5E and a bunch of other stuff, but also how does the package itself know which version of Moddable you're using, because there's not a way of specifying like, I'm using this version of the SDK right now for this package, but it's not yet supported for it. So those are the implications we want to think about in terms of supporting third-party modules, and it's why it's so easy to pull stuff from the SDK itself first, but also, having projects that depend on multiple versions of the SDK is something else I've been thinking about on ways to partition that out efficiently. And we've discussed this a little bit around like, splitting out the core of the SDK versus the build tooling versus, the vendored modules, to help folks better understand and potentially work on multiple projects and multiple different code bases. So that's kind of what's my thinking. And I think one thing that's informing this is seeing what folks like Dino are doing to support, NPM and the package ecosystem, but also be a bit more, standards friendly, using things like import maps, as opposed to, which I think you taught me, like there is a sort of part of import maps that are built into the manifest.json specification, but may not be. I haven't dug too deep into that part of it. So those are what's still kind of part of it. I think we can ship 1.0 of XSDev without having this built into it, but those are like the further explorations we get into. We can iterate on it too. We can ship an initial version and see how well that works, and see how many issues people run into at this point in time.
Yeah, no, I think for sure it's a good follow-on for kind of the first version of XSDev. There's already so much power and value there. It makes sense to kind of declare it at a milestone, and really encourage people to start using it. I think there's some interesting discovery challenges too, in that there's a chunk of the Node ecosystem, for example, that's basically just pure JavaScript modules, and we see people who are using those in their projects basically as is. and they work just fine. But there's there's no shared way for people to kind of know that those modules are compatible, and it may well be that the developers of those modules are not sort of open to making changes or even adding tags to their repository, because they don't want to be obliged to support the embedded ecosystem if they're not a part of it. And so there may be some community-based mechanisms where those things can be pointed to or referenced, and because somebody else discovered that they were supportable. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuances and subtlety here to kind of get right. So I think it's good not to rush into it, and great to listen to a range of voices on the subject.
Yeah, the quick anecdote around that sort of topic of like, it might not be supported for this ecosystem that was one of the sort of biggest pain points but also benefits in what Tesla learned from Tesla 1 to Tesla 2, where Tesla 1 was actually taking Node and compiling it to Lua, like transpiling basically to Lua, and they had a bunch of popular packages they had targeted to also have like Lua versions of that for things like Express.js and whatever else that was out there. But this was not scalable for the small team doing that, to make sure they were constantly targeting the right things and making sure they could compile it to the Lua ecosystem on the Tesla 1. And then Tesla 2, they actually ran actual Node.js on the device. So they didn't have to do any more transpiling. However, the device was running, MIPS or MIPSIL as like the target architecture, which not every single node module with a native extension could, always compile to. So we actually had our own process of, watching the feed from NPM and compiling, native extensions for, these packages and these various versions, and then storing them in S3 and pulling them down dynamically to ship onto the device. And then that, as well as like its whole infrastructure, and we're open source projects. So we didn't have like, we had some funds to do that, but it was also, a very small team to support that whole ecosystem. So those are the sort of pitfalls and stuff that I've seen that are like informing, exactly like these decision making, and how we can help at least educate folks like, hey, if you're picking a module, here's how to go about doing it, and here's what happens when it doesn't support it, and how we can just make sure people know and aren't as surprised when something goes wrong.
Yeah, no, that's that kind of experience is really great in informing this, so we avoid some of these problems that aren't so obvious when you start, but man, can be painful once you get in deep.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. So I think I'm going to kind of wrap this part of the call, and I do want to show one more thing real quick, and then we can kind of kick it over to Q&A and discussion and hang out here as long as anybody wants to. But just one more thing to kind of wrap up our discussion on XSDev. I did want to give a quick shout out to a video that Daniel Abdu on our team put together recently. So if you go to YouTube and just put in "getting started with XSDev," there's a quick 5-minute video there now that walks you through how to get prerequisites installed on macOS and Linux, and pull down XSDev and start working with it to work with the Moddable SDK. So definitely give that a look if you are wanting to get started with XSDev today. And with that, I do want to just kind of wrap this part of the call and say thank you to everybody that could call in today and join us here. And if you couldn't make it today, please drop by our Gitter to chat, start a new discussion on our GitHub repository, or contact us on Twitter at Moddable Tech, and we'll see you on all of those places and get back to you very quickly. And otherwise, we will see you next month after the April release.